Hello, today is Thursday, August 19th, 2021. I'm Joe Schmidt from TC2, and this is Staying Connected. On today's podcast, I'm joined by my TC2 colleague, Bryan Carriker, and we are going to take a look at what you can do to position your company to successfully implement a new ICT deal. Both Bryan and I have seen firsthand that all of your best laid technology transformation plans and promises to end users can blow up in your face if you screw up the implementation. And that's obviously something that you want to avoid. Hey, Bryan, thanks for joining me today. So what can cause an implementation to go badly? Or rather, because I'm an optimistic guy, what needs to be done so that the implementation is successful?
Hi, Joe. It's great to be with you today. What we see often happen is, and it happens regularly, parties enter into a new deal, a contract is written, and the responsible parties for implementing that contract are told to get on with it. They have this contract and they're asking themselves the key question, what was included in the contract and what do we need to do now? Hopefully some kind of structured procurement was done and used to get to that final contract. A well-constructed RFP process will request and evaluate suppliers' proposed implementation team, their implementation timeline, guarantees. They'll be asked how they can help to minimize cost. And Joe, then SLAs, when do they start on the new service? The key differentiators in the bidder's proposals need to be evaluated in selecting the new partner. Once you have these items and they're agreed to, then they all need to be built into the contract.
All right, so you just rattled off a lot there, but you started by saying an enterprise needs to evaluate a proposed implementation team. How do you do that? I mean, what criteria needs to be considered with regard to the implementation team?
So you've got a scope of the RFP and the services that you want to include. And so you would ask the bidders to respond with their proposed implementation teams. Those requests need to be evaluated and understood. And those implementation teams can include project managers and coordinators, architects, engineers, operations managers, and any number of specialists. Those specialists are like asset and inventory management, change management, financial management, contract management. There'd be report development, maybe, and communication specialists, and that's just to name a few. And all of those aren't included in every deal, but that's a good starting point to add and subtract to. And then once you receive those proposals, Joe, you want to cross-reference those and mine, if you will, any insights that one proposal has over the other. The implementation team needs to have a real good knowledge of the RFP services, but also to take into consideration the duration, the skill set, the number of resources, all impact the implementation team. If the scope of the project is regional and with a single service, then it's less complicated and should be considered, right, in the mass of this implementation team. But if it's a global effort with transport and multiple technologies and new sites being installed across multiple sites, then you need to account for that.
Now, I can see where things could go terribly wrong with an implementation if the implementation's team's responsibilities are not clearly defined and understood early in the game. But let's assume that those implementation team requirements are well articulated and a company feels comfortable with what the vendor brings to the project. What ultimately is the implementation team expected to do?
I mean, Joe, they are going to, first of all, and it's what we would expect, and that's just implementing the new service and technology. But the pieces that can hang you in the end, if you will, are communicating with your end stakeholders, maximizing your savings. These all need to be taken into account during that implementation process. They also need to transition the services and shut down the services of the incumbent vendor. These services, if they're left to overlap, they can really eat you alive as far as your potential savings. And taking down these services can be managed either internally with the enterprise or by one of the vendors, but these need to be taken into account and measured against the implementation timeline.
And what about that timeline? How is the implementation timeline developed?
Well, the implementation plan should be requested as part of the RFP process. And soon after you sign the contract, you'll want to build into the contract that an implementation plan will be delivered to the enterprise. When you select a new vendor, you need to consider their proposed implementation plan and the timeline. Those businesses are in the business of delivering services, so they should have the best indication of how long it's going to take them to implement those services. Sourcing and engineering and operations organizations all need to be involved in evaluating to make sure that both functionally and financially their business needs are being met. And with all of that, you need to also consider the indirects that aren't directly related to those services, and that's maintenance contracts and service contracts. When are they expiring? You want to make sure that the maintenance contracts don't lapse, for instance. And you also don't want to let discounts lapse either. And letting those discounts expire can have a dramatic impact on rates. And then you want to make sure term commitments have been met. If you don't want to go in and pay an early disconnect fee for any of those services. So paying attention to that is critical in making sure you maximize your potential savings.
How do you know if an implementation timeline is realistic?
The errors we see are with people being overly aggressive, just wanting it done too fast. They're either trying to escape a vendor or move to new savings, and they want to do it too aggressively, or they let it run too long and they build in too much time. And they don't get to the savings and new services, and it frustrates everybody. So you want to make sure that those timelines strike a real balance, because that timeline in the end is going to be used to set expectations with stakeholders. And you want to keep that as realistic as possible. During the RFP process, the bidder should be asked to provide references, and interviews should be done with those references. You want to make sure that the scope is similar and that the sizing is similar. And then you want to talk through with those vendors to have actual meetings with them. And I know that can be unusual, if you will, but set up meetings with those references. Sit down and talk with them and ask them some tough questions. They'll be happy to share what they've learned. And I would make sure that you ask what their experience was during the implementation. What were their delays? What internally caused delays? What with the vendor caused delays? And then what were those specific delays? And then who caused them? And that's critical. A lot of time the enterprise causes the delays just in not getting information, data, or other peripheral contracts, or equipment's not ready, or a site's not ready, or they have a special run in manufacturing going on that causes delays. All of these things can cause delays. So you want to know who caused them as well. And then take that valuable input from the references and bring that back to the timeline. And it'll be pretty obvious whether it's realistic or not.
So it sounds like a timeline is really just a framework for getting the job done, right? I mean, presumably an enterprise also needs implementation guarantees backed by SLAs with penalties.
You're exactly right. Implementation guarantees need to be linked to measurable milestones. A good example of a measurable milestone is something like the final site migration per the agreed upon date. Right? So what you're setting there is how long after we sign this contract will we finish the final migration of the last site? And then you want to capture in your contract and then your RFP what the proposed number of days are after that signed contract. And then you want to know what the monetary credit's going to be if that particular milestone is missed. So each of those milestones need to be clear, and the guarantee against those need to be very clear. And I'd be looking to see guarantees related to the implementation timeline, when that initial implementation plan is going to be provided, the formation of the implementation team, and many others. One of the things that we've seen, Joe, is it's a real good idea to give the bidders input on the milestones. They know what measuring points they need to hit to meet the service. New vendors want their services installed. They want to start making money. And so they're going to have a good idea of what milestones they want to meet. And so that implementation plan delivery, you'll often see added knowledge transfer. And then you want to ensure that parallel services are addressed to hit those savings milestones we talked about. And then go live dates. If the RFP and scope have regions or phases or waves or different individual services and technologies, then you might want to break down milestones related to those as well. These milestones then need to, again, be taken back, compared against each vendor, and make sure that they are reasonable and realistic. And then again, Joe, the objective here is to move successfully and peacefully from one service to another or one provider to another. The objective is not to get a monetary credit. And so you want to use this to instill an accountability into the process, but you're not out to pursue a credit. So once the bidders agree to this, then you need to move forward in a real measurable manner.
So when do SLAs start?
SLAs are an important part of the negotiation process, and I recommend starting the SLA negotiation early and not delaying that discussion. For measuring SLAs, I would want that done immediately so that you know what's being delivered as soon as possible. And then if you're doing a large managed services engagement or something like that, it's reasonable to give some time for that service to stabilize, if you will. And so you could delay the credits a month or two, but you want to be measuring the whole time. If the service is not something like a managed services deal, then you might not want to delay those credits. It's not sensible to delay those for a long time. And so something like the first day of the first full month might be the reasonable time to start those credits. Negotiating, and what I'd want to really get across here, Joe, is that it's not when. It's just that you want to negotiate those early in the process because everything else is going to feed off of those deliveries. Again, you don't want the SLA credit in the end. You want smooth transitions and smooth milestone services. And you want to move successfully and peacefully. So you want to make sure measuring is done immediately.
Bryan, you've mentioned savings and things that can erode those savings a few times today. Talk to me about the financial considerations of an implementation. What does a company need to do to optimize the implementation to make it cost effective?
You know, Joe, this is critical, right? You can enter into a 3-year deal, 4-year, 5-year deal with a new vendor and have all of these savings that you project in your budget. And if the implementation goes wrong, you can ruin a deal in the first 6 months. And so what you want to do is optimize those savings. And you do that by addressing overlapping services, making sure that when one service is stood up, that the second service is brought down. You want to negotiate with your new vendor that there won't be overlapping charges if you can. You want to ensure that if circuits are being delivered, that there's a time set. And if they're delivered early, the charges don't start when they're delivered. They start when they're implemented on an agreed date. Hardware that arrives early, we don't charge for it until an agreed time. And you want to deliver the biggest savings first. You know, if you have a circuit that is very expensive with one vendor and you're moving to your new vendor and going to see substantial savings, you want to do those big ones first. And then you want to manage service termination. Getting the new services installed is a great thing, but you want to stop the billing on the old services. And then managing your term commitments. You don't want to pay early termination fees. And so managing those down to minimals, all of those is the real critical piece in ensuring savings.
Okay, thank you, Bryan. This has been a good discussion. As you heard, successful implementations start during the procurement process and before you hand the executed contract over to the implementation team. If you'd like to learn more about ICT implementations, please contact Bryan, me, or any of our LB3 and TC2 colleagues by giving us a call or dropping us an email. You can also stay current by subscribing to these Staying Connected podcasts, checking out our websites, and by following us on LinkedIn.